Question 1. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. The Azure mobile app enables users to review the latest alerts and even connect to virtual machines directly from their phone. Now that we have seen the question and the correct answers, let us walk through why these options are right and why the others are not. First, review the latest alerts is correct, because the Azure mobile app is designed to keep administrators informed about service health and notifications, so they can quickly see what is happening in their environment, even when they are away from a computer. Next, connect to virtual machines is correct because the app can remotely connect to virtual machines for basic management tasks, which means an admin could check on a server or restart it while on the go. However, configure SDKs would not fit, since software development kits are installed and configured on development machines, not from a mobile management app. Likewise, deploy databases is not appropriate because full database deployment is done through Portal, scripts, or pipelines, not from this light management app. Finally, write ARM templates is wrong because templates are authored in code editors for automation, not as a feature of the mobile app interface. Question 2. For each Azure Cloud Shell feature, drag it to its correct description. Provides a browser-accessible command line interface, matches Azure Cloud Shell, supports both Bash and PowerShell environments, matches shell choice, Bash or PowerShell, ensures security with double encryption at rest, matches data encryption, allows persistence of SSH keys and scripts between sessions, matches cloud storage, built-in interface to modify files such as scripts, matches Cloud Shell Editor. Now that we have gone through the question and the correct matches, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Azure Cloud Shell works as a browser-based command line experience, which means you can manage Azure resources without installing anything locally. Moreover, the option for shell choice is important because different teams prefer different workflows. For example, a Windows admin may choose PowerShell, whereas a Linux engineer might prefer Bash. Additionally, data encryption ensures that anything stored in Cloud Shell is protected using double encryption at rest, which is crucial for maintaining security compliance. Furthermore, cloud storage provides persistence, allowing SSH keys and scripts to remain available across sessions, so you don't lose your work each time you log in. Finally, the Cloud Shell Editor helps users modify scripts directly in the browser, making quick edits possible without opening an external IDE. Question 3. For each statement below, indicate whether it is true or false. The first string in a bash command is always treated as the command is true. The question mark wildcard matches 0 or more characters is false. Linux does not assign special meaning to file extensions like PNG is true. In Bash, a backslash can escape a wildcard, so it is treated literally as true. Now that we have reviewed the statements and their correct truth values, let's move into the explanation. First, the first string in a bash command is indeed the command itself, which is why Bash interprets it as the executable to run. Meanwhile, the question mark wildcard only matches exactly one character, not 0 or more, which makes the original statement incorrect. Additionally, Linux treats file extensions as part of the file name with no special behavior. For example, a .png file is not handled differently by the OS, the way Windows uses extensions to determine file types. Finally, the backslash serves as an escape character, allowing you to treat special symbols like wildcards literally. For instance, escaping an asterisk prevents it from expanding to matching files. Question 4. Which bash command shows who is currently logged in and what they are doing? Select one answer. Option A, PS. Option B, W. Option C, Who Amy. Option D, Top. The correct answer is W. Now that we have gone through all the options and the correct answer, let's move into the explanation. First, the W command is the right choice because it displays logged-in users, their IP addresses, login times, and the activities they are performing. Meanwhile, PS only lists system processes, so it cannot show who is logged in. Additionally, Whoome returns only your own username, offering no view of other users. Finally, top focuses on CPU and memory usage, not user activity, which is why it does not answer the question. Question 5. Your team requires automation for CI/CD pipelines with auditable, repeatable scripts. Which PowerShell capability best meets this requirement? Select one answer. Option A, using aliases for faster typing. Option B, installing Visual Studio Code extension. Option C, running commands without parameters. Option D, storing scripts in source control. The correct answer is storing scripts in source control. Now that we have reviewed all the options and identified the correct answer, let's move into the explanation. To begin, storing scripts in source control provides traceability, versioning, and auditing, which are essential for CI/CD environments where changes must be tracked and validated consistently. Additionally, using aliases may improve typing speed, but it has no impact on automation or auditability. Furthermore, installing a Visual Studio Code extension enhances the development workflow, but does not contribute to script compliance or repeatability. Lastly, running commands without parameters is unrelated to automation requirements because it neither improves consistency nor enables auditing. Question 6. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. PowerShell started as a Windows automation tool but is now cross-platform is true. Commandlets in PowerShell are separate executables, just like in traditional shells, is false. The PowerShell pipeline passes objects, not plain text, is true. Aliases like CLS and LS make it easier for new users is true. Now that we have reviewed each statement and its correct truth value, let's move into the explanation. First, PowerShell originally began as a Windows-only automation framework, yet it later evolved into PowerShell Core, which runs on Windows, macOS, and Linux, making the first statement accurate. Meanwhile, commandlets are not separate executables. Instead, they are .NET classes executed within the PowerShell runtime, which is why the second statement is false. Additionally, unlike traditional shells that pass text between commands, PowerShell passes rich .NET objects through the pipeline, enabling more intelligent and structured automation. Finally, aliases such as CLS for clear screen or LS for listing directory content help new users transition from other shells, making PowerShell more approachable. Question 7. Which two deployment commands are currently recommended for ARM template deployments? Select two answers. Option A as deployment group create. Option B, new AZ resource group deployment. Option C, AZ group deployment create. Option D, AZ configure defaults. The correct answers are AZ deployment group create and new AZ resource group deployment. Now that we have reviewed all the options and identified the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin, AZ deployment group create is the recommended Azure CLI command for deploying ARM templates at the resource group level, ensuring compatibility with the latest deployment engine. Similarly, new AZ resource group deployment is the updated PowerShell commandlet that aligns with the current deployment practices, making it the proper PowerShell equivalent. Meanwhile, AZ group deployment create has been deprecated and replaced with AZ deployment group create, so it should no longer be used. Finally, AZ configure-defaults is not related to deployments at all because it only sets default values for the CLI environment rather than executing deployments. Question 8. For each directory or service statement, drag the correct concept to the correct match column. Protocol used to query and manage ADDS directories matches LDAP. Primary authentication protocol used by ADDS matches Kerberos. Service used by ADDS to locate domain controllers matches DNS. Web authentication protocols used by Microsoft Entra ID match SAML, WS Federation, OpenID Connect. Authorization framework used by Microsoft Entra ID matches OAuth 2.0. Now that we have reviewed each option and its correct match, let's move into the explanation. To begin, LDAP is the standard directory protocol for querying and managing Active Directory domain services, making it the correct match for the first statement. Moreover, Kerberos is the default ticket-based authentication system used by ADDS, so it naturally fits the second statement. Additionally, DNS is essential because clients depend on it to discover domain controllers and related ADDS services, which explains why it matches the third statement. Furthermore, Microsoft Entra ID relies on SAML WS Federation. Question 9. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Microsoft Entra Domain Services runs as part of the Microsoft Entra ID P1 or P2 tier is true. Only the base computer Active Directory object is supported by the service is true. There's a built-in GPO for computer and user accounts, but you can't target OUs with it. Or use WMI or security group filtering is true. Even without any local ADDS, you can use Microsoft Entra Domain Services as a cloud-only service is true. Now that we have gone through each statement and its correct true or false value, let's move into the explanation. First, Microsoft Entra Domain Services is delivered as a managed service that is included with the premium Microsoft Entra ID P1 or P2 tiers, so it is accurate to say it runs as part of those premium tiers. Next, the service focuses on providing computer account support for domain join scenarios, which is why only the base computer Active Directory object type is available, rather than the full range of on-prem object classes. Furthermore, Microsoft provides built-in GPOs that apply to computers and users, but because this is a managed domain, administrators cannot create OU-targeted GPOs or use techniques like WMI or security group filtering, so that limitation makes the third statement true. Finally, because the service is fully hosted by Microsoft, you can enable a managed domain in the cloud even when you have no existing on-premises Active Directory at all, which means it absolutely can function as a cloud-only domain service. Question 10. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Microsoft Workplace Analytics is an add-on that requires a prerequisite to be present in the same group, such as Exchange Online Plan 1 or Exchange Online Plan 2. Now that we have read the question and the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Workplace Analytics is sold as an add-on, meaning it cannot be assigned by itself. It depends on another eligible license already being present. Additionally, the required prerequisite is an Exchange Online license, and either Plan 1 or Plan 2 satisfies this requirement because Workplace Analytics relies on mailbox data to generate insights. Moreover, if neither Exchange Online plan is present in the license group, the portal will block the assignment, which highlights why these prerequisites are mandatory. Finally, other licenses such as Office 365 E5, Microsoft Teams, or Microsoft Defender do not meet this dependency because they do not provide the mailbox foundation. Workplace Analytics needs to operate. Question 11. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. A region is a geographical area that contains one or more nearby low-latency network data centers is true. In AZ-enabled regions, there are at least 3 separate availability zones for resiliency is true. All Azure regions currently support availability zones is false. Most regions are paired within the same geography, at least 300 miles apart, to reduce correlated risk is true. Now that we have reviewed each statement and its correct true or false value, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Azure defines a region as a grouping of one or more data centers that are located close enough to provide low latency connectivity, which confirms that the first statement is accurate. Additionally, availability zone-enabled regions always include a minimum of 3 independent zones, ensuring high resiliency by spreading workloads across isolated data center groups. However, not every region supports availability zones today, which makes the third statement false because some regions still operate without zone redundancy. Finally, Azure pairs regions within the same geography and typically keeps them at least 300 miles apart. This design helps reduce the chance that both regions are impacted by the same disaster, while also supporting prioritized recovery during failover. Question 12. Arrange the following Azure physical or geo hierarchy from the broadest scope to the most granular unit. Geography, region pair, region, availability zone, data center. Now that we have reviewed the items and placed them in the correct order, let's move into the explanation. To begin, geography represents the largest classification, covering broad areas such as the Americas, Europe, or Asia, and defining compliance boundaries. Following that, Azure organizes region pairs within each geography to support disaster recovery, ensuring that paired regions remain far enough apart to avoid simultaneous failures. Next, an Azure region is a deployment area made up of one or more data centers that share low-latency connectivity. After that, availability zones exist inside a region and provide isolated data center groups with independent power, cooling, and networking, helping achieve resiliency. Finally, the data center is the most granular physical building, where the actual compute, storage, and networking infrastructure resides. Question 13. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. An Azure subscription links to an Azure account, which is an identity in Microsoft Entra ID, or in a directory that Microsoft Entra ID trusts. Now that we have read the question and the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin, every Azure subscription must be associated with an Azure account because the account represents the identity that owns and manages that subscription. Additionally, this identity resides in Microsoft Entra ID, which acts as the authentication and authorization system for Azure resources. Moreover, the account can also exist in a trusted external directory, meaning Azure can validate and accept an identity that isn't stored directly in the tenant, but is recognized through federation or trust. Finally, other options such as resource groups or management groups are organizational containers rather than identities, which is why they do not satisfy the requirement for subscription ownership. Question 14. You created the Marketing Security Group and the Chris Green user. In the Entra ID group blade, you see no licenses assigned. You want group-based licensing, so members get a product license through the group. What's the next place you should go to assign a license to the group? Select one answer. Option A, Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Option B, Microsoft Entra ID, Users, All Users. Option C, Azure Portal, Subscriptions, Access Control IAM. Option D, Endpoint Manager Admin Center. The correct answer is Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Now that we have reviewed all the options and identified the correct answer, let's move into the explanation. To begin, group-based licensing is configured from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center because that portal manages product licenses and allows you to assign them directly to groups. Meanwhile, Microsoft Entra ID, Users. All Users simply lists users and doesn't provide the interface needed for group licensing. Additionally, Azure Portal Subscriptions Access Control IAM manages access roles for resources, not product licenses, so it cannot be used for this task. Finally, the Endpoint Manager Admin Center focuses on device and application management rather than Microsoft 365 license assignments, which is why it isn't the correct place to configure group licensing. Question 15. When assigning a product license to a security group, what additional configuration can an admin apply at assignment time? Select one answer. Option A. Disable one or more service plans in that product. Option B. Force users' usage location to United States. Option C. Automatically convert Microsoft 365 groups into security groups. Option D. Assign device licenses to endpoints directly. The correct answer is disable one or more service plans in that product. Now that we have reviewed all the options and identified the correct answer, let's move into the explanation. To begin, when assigning a license to a group, admins can selectively turn off specific service plans within that product. For example, they might disable Yammer or Stream if they don't want those services enabled for the group. Meanwhile, Usage location cannot be force set through license assignment because it is a user profile property that may be inherited from the directory. Additionally, Microsoft 365 groups are not automatically converted into security groups, so that option does not apply here. Finally, group-based licensing affects user licenses rather than device licenses, meaning administrators cannot assign device licenses directly through this method. Question 16. Which items are included with the Azure free account? Select 3 answers. Option A, free access to popular Azure products for 12 months. Option B, a credit to use for the first 30 days. Option C, access to more than 25 products that are always free. Option D, no credit card required to sign up. Option E, automatic cleanup of resources when the credit expires. The correct answers are A, B, and C. Now that we have reviewed all the options and identified the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Azure offers free access to a set of popular services for 12 months, allowing new users to explore key capabilities without immediate cost. Additionally, Microsoft provides a credit for the first 30 days so users can test paid services beyond the free tier, giving flexibility during initial experimentation. Moreover, Azure includes more than 25 services that are always free, such as functions, logic apps triggers, and certain storage or monitoring features, which remain available even after the trial period ends. Meanwhile, signing up still requires a credit card for identity verification, so option D is not included. Finally, Azure will not automatically delete your resources after the credit expires. Users must manually remove or stop them to avoid charges, which makes option E incorrect. Question 17. Your organization discovers several existing resources deployed outside West Europe. Leadership wants to stop any new out-of-region deployments immediately and see an updated compliance view for existing resources without deleting what's already running. What actions satisfy these requirements? Select 2 answers. Option A. Configure Azure Resource Manager to auto-delete existing out-of-region resources upon policy assignment. Option B. Expect Azure Policy to move existing resources into West Europe automatically. Option C. Change only data plane ACLs. This will block new out-of-region control plane deployments. Option D. Assign a policy that restricts resource creation to West Europe. Option E. Manually trigger a compliance scan after policy assignment to refresh the compliance state. The correct answers are Option D. Assign a policy that restricts resource creation to West Europe, and Option E. Manually trigger a compliance scan after policy assignment to refresh the compliance state. Now that we have read the scenario, all the options, and the correct answers, let's walk through why D and E are the right choices. First, assigning a policy that restricts resource creation to West Europe uses Azure Policy at the control plane to deny any new deployments in other regions, which immediately stops non-compliant resources from being created while leaving existing ones untouched. Furthermore, manually triggering a compliance scan right after the policy is assigned forces Azure Policy to reevaluate all current resources so the compliance dashboard accurately shows which ones are already outside West Europe without waiting for the next automatic cycle. By contrast, Azure Resource Manager does not auto-delete resources just because a policy is assigned, so option A would not meet the requirement of keeping existing workloads running. Likewise, Azure Policy does not move or migrate resources between regions, so option B describes behavior that simply does not occur. Finally, changing only data plane ACLs controls access to the resources themselves, but does nothing to block new deployments in other regions, which is why option C fails to satisfy leadership's goal. Question 18. A platform team assigns multiple Azure policy definitions across scopes. At the management group, a built-in allowed locations policy is assigned with effect equals deny. At the subscription, a custom tag application required policy is assigned with effect equals audit. At one resource group, the same allowed locations policy is assigned, but with effect equals disabled. A developer attempts to create a storage account in a disallowed location within that resource group. Select 2 answers. Option A. The create request is rejected because the management group assignment with deny blocks non-compliant deployments. Option B. The disabled resource group assignment prevents the management group assignment from evaluating. Option C. The tag policy logs non-compliance but doesn't stop the deployment. Option D. The deny can be bypassed because another assignment only audits. The correct answers are Option A. The create request is rejected because the management group assignment with deny blocks non-compliant deployments, and Option C. The tag policy logs non-compliance but doesn't stop the deployment. Now that we have read the scenario, all 4 options, and the correct answers, let's walk through why A and C are correct. First, the deny effect at the management group is still active and evaluated independently, so when the storage account is created in a disallowed region, that higher scope policy immediately blocks the deployment, which is why Option A is true. Meanwhile, the resource group assignment is disabled, so it simply does nothing at that scope and cannot override or cancel the deny at the management group, which shows why Option B is wrong. Furthermore, the tag policy at the subscription uses the audit effect, meaning it only records a non-compliant event for missing or incorrect tags but never blocks the deployment. So Option C correctly states that it logs non-compliance without stopping anything. Finally, an audit assignment never allows you to bypass a deny. Azure policy combines results to enforce the most restrictive outcome, so the deny cannot be overridden by an audit-only policy, making Option D incorrect. Question 19. How is Microsoft Entra Domain Services billed? Select one answer. Option A, per user per month, independent of directory size. Option B, per hour, based on the size of your directory. Option C, per vCPU of the virtual machines joined to the domain. Option D, included for free with any Azure subscription. The correct answer is per hour based on the size of your directory. Now that we have reviewed all the options and identified the correct answer, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Microsoft Entra Domain Services uses an hourly billing model that scales according to the size of the directory, meaning that larger directories cost more because they require more managed resources. Meanwhile, billing is not calculated per user, so Option A does not reflect the actual model. Additionally, VM CPU usage has no relationship to the cost of Entra Domain Services, which makes Option C incorrect. Finally, the service is not included for free with an Azure subscription, so Option D cannot be chosen. Question 20. For each public IP configuration setting, drag it to the correct description, choose IPv4, IPv6, or both matches IP version. Must match the SKU of the Azure load balancer matches SKU. Unique identifier within a resource group matches name. Defines whether the address is static or dynamic matches IP address assignment. Now that we have reviewed each item and its correct match, let's move into the explanation. To begin, when creating a public IP, you must specify the IP version, choosing whether it will use IPv4, IPv6, or a dual stack configuration, which explains why the first option aligns with IP version. Additionally, the SKU must match the load balancer SKU, because Azure requires consistency between public IP SKUs and the load balancer tier, ensuring compatibility during deployment. Moreover, the name field simply identifies the resource uniquely within the resource group, so Azure can track and reference it correctly. Finally, the IP address assignment determines whether the public IP remains static or can change dynamically, which directly ties to how the IP behaves over time. Question 21. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Border Gateway Protocol is commonly used to advertise on-premises routes to Azure, especially when connected via ExpressRoute. Now that we have read the question and the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Border Gateway Protocol functions as the industry-standard routing protocol for exchanging routes between different networks, which makes it the natural choice for hybrid connectivity scenarios. Additionally, organizations use it to advertise on-premises routes toward Azure so that Azure services can correctly route traffic back to corporate networks. Moreover, this routing exchange is often paired with ExpressRoute, a private and reliable connection that bypasses the public internet while supporting BGP for dynamic route updates. Finally, other options such as service chaining or system room don't apply here because they don't handle external route advertisement, and storage endpoints relate to data access rather than network routing. Question 22. For each statement below, indicate true or false. Azure allows administrators to create multiple route tables is true. Each route table can only be used once across a single subnet is false. Route tables in Azure cannot be shared across subnets is false. Creating a route table is required for every VNet by default is false. Now that we have reviewed the statements and their correct truth values, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Azure fully supports creating multiple route tables, allowing administrators to design custom routing behavior for different network segments. Additionally, a single route table can be associated with more than one subnet, so the idea that it can be used only once is incorrect. Moreover, because route tables can indeed be shared across multiple subnets, the notion that they cannot be shared is also incorrect. Finally, VNets automatically rely on system routes unless administrators choose to override them, which means route tables are optional and not required by default. Question 23. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Azure Load Balancer provides Layer 4 transport layer load balancing for TCP and UDP, while Azure Front Door provides Layer 7 global application delivery with caching and WAF features. Now that we have seen the question and the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Azure Load Balancer operates at Layer 4 of the OSI model, which means it routes traffic based on transport-level information such as TCP and UDP ports, making it suitable for scenarios like distributing traffic to virtual machines. Additionally, this Layer 4 approach focuses on high-performance network traffic without inspecting application-level data. Meanwhile, Azure Front Door works at Layer 7, enabling application-aware routing, global load balancing, caching, and web application firewall protection, all of which require understanding HTTP and HTTPS traffic. Finally, services like Traffic Manager or the DNS layer cannot replace these behaviors because they operate at the DNS level, not at layers 4 or 7, and therefore lack the real-time traffic steering capabilities provided by Load Balancer and Front Door. Question 24. For each Azure Application Gateway feature, drag it to the appropriate description in the correct match column. Protects against common web vulnerabilities, matches web application firewall, ensures requests in the same client session are routed to the same server, matches session stickiness, allows graceful removal of servers during updates, matches connection draining, supports encrypted communication between client and gateway, matches TLS SSL encryption. Now that we have reviewed each item and its correct match, let's move into the explanation. To begin, the Web Application Firewall provides essential protection against threats like SQL injection and cross-site scripting, making it crucial for securing web applications. Additionally, session stickiness keeps a user's requests routed to the same backend instance, which is especially important for scenarios like shopping carts or authenticated sessions. Moreover, connection draining ensures servers can be safely taken out of rotation during maintenance without abruptly cutting off active user connections, helping maintain a smooth user experience. Finally, TLS and SSL encryption secure the communication channel between the client and the application gateway, ensuring data is transmitted safely over the network. Question 25. For each statement below, indicate whether it is true or false. Application Gateway load balances traffic at OSI Layer 7 based on host names and paths is true. Azure Load Balancer distributes traffic using routing rules at OSI Layer 7 is false. The WAF in Application Gateway can detect HTTP request smuggling and SQL injection is true. A default health probe considers a server unhealthy if it does not respond for 30 seconds is true. Now that we have reviewed each statement and its correct truth value, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Application Gateway operates at Layer 7, which allows it to inspect HTTP and HTTPS traffic and make routing decisions based on the hostname or URL path, enabling advanced application-aware load balancing. Additionally, Azure Load Balancer works at Layer 4, focusing on TCP and UDP traffic, and therefore cannot apply Layer 7 logic, which makes the second statement false. Moreover, the web application firewall inside Application Gateway protects against sophisticated threats such as SQL injection and request smuggling, giving applications a strong security layer. Finally, the default health probe waits 30 seconds before marking a backend as unhealthy, ensuring that temporary delays or short interruptions don't immediately remove a server from rotation. Question 26. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. The topology tool in Network Watcher can display load balancer health probes and VPN gateway connections is true. Resource associations in topology can only use the association type value contains is false. VPN troubleshoot returns fields such as start time, code, and recommended actions is true. Packet capture data can only be stored in Azure Blob Storage is false. Now that we have reviewed the statements and their correct truth values, let's move into the explanation. To begin, the topology tool visualizes network components and their relationships, including items like load balancer health probes and VPN gateway connections, which confirms the first statement. Additionally, topology associations can use multiple association type values, such as associated or contains, so it is incorrect to claim that only one value is used. Moreover, VPN troubleshoot outputs important diagnostic data including timestamps, status codes, and recommended actions to help identify connection issues. Finally, packet capture files can be saved either locally or to Azure Storage, so they are not limited to blob storage only, making the last statement false. Question 27. Which two values can be used for both the source and destination filters in an NSG rule? Select two answers. Option A, a resource group. Option B, an application security group. Option C, a default tag. Option D, an availability zone. The correct answers are an application security group and a default tag. Now that we have reviewed all the options and identified the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin, an application security group is designed for grouping virtual machine NICs, so you can easily apply NSG rules to sets of workloads without needing individual IP addresses, making it valid for both source and destination filters. Additionally, default tags such as virtual network or internet can be used in NSG rules to simplify filtering based on Azure-defined categories, which is why option C is also correct. Meanwhile, resource groups are organizational containers only and cannot be used as filtering criteria in NSG rules, so option A is not valid. Finally, availability zones relate to fault isolation and redundancy rather than network filtering, meaning they also cannot be used for NSG source or destination fields, which makes option D incorrect. Question 28. Alias record sets in Azure DNS can point to which three Azure resources? Select three answers. Option A, an Azure public IP address. Option B, an Azure Traffic Manager profile. Option C, an Azure Policy Initiative. Option D, an Azure Virtual Machine Scale Set. Option E, an Azure Content Delivery Network Endpoint. The correct answers are Option A, an Azure Public IP Address, Option B, an Azure Traffic Manager Profile, and Option E, an Azure Content Delivery Network Endpoint. Now that we have reviewed the options and identified the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin, alias records can directly reference Azure public IP addresses, enabling dynamic DNS updates whenever the public IP changes. Additionally, they integrate smoothly with Azure Traffic Manager profiles, allowing DNS responses to follow Traffic Manager's routing decisions for global traffic distribution. Moreover, alias records can target CDN endpoints, making it easy to direct users to optimized content delivery services without manually updating DNS entries. Meanwhile, virtual machine scale sets cannot be targeted directly because alias records only reference endpoints, not entire scale sets. Finally, Azure policy initiatives are not DNS-related resources, so they cannot be used as alias targets, making option C invalid. Question 29. When creating a DNS zone, what determines the default location for the zone? Select one answer, option A, the domain registrar's location. Option B, the subscription region. Option C, the location of the resource group. Option D, the Azure DNS name server location. The correct answer is the location of the resource group. Now that we have reviewed all the options and identified the correct answer, let's move into the explanation. To begin, when you create a DNS zone in Azure, it automatically inherits the location of the resource group, even though DNS itself is a global service, which makes option C correct. Additionally, the domain registrar's location is irrelevant here because registrar services operate externally and have no impact on Azure resource placement. Moreover, Azure subscriptions are not bound to a specific region, so option B cannot influence the DNS zone's default location. Finally, Azure DNS name servers are globally distributed and do not define the zone's creation location, which is why option D is not valid. Question 30. Which two hop types can be selected when creating user-defined routes? Select two answers. Option A, virtual appliance. Option B, service endpoint. Option C, virtual network service endpoint. Option D, internet. The correct answers are virtual appliance and internet. Now that we have read the question, all the options and the correct answers, let's walk through the explanation together. First, virtual appliance is valid because a user-defined route can send traffic to a network virtual appliance, such as a firewall or packet inspection device, identified by its private IP address. This lets you force all traffic through that appliance before it reaches other networks, just like sending all branch office traffic through a central firewall in a real company. Furthermore, Internet is also a supported next hop, which tells Azure to send matching traffic out to the public internet. For example, when you route 0.0.0.0/0 to the internet from a specific subnet. However, service endpoint is not a selectable next hop in a user-defined route. It is simply a feature that secures access to Azure services from a virtual network. Likewise, virtual network service endpoint is explicitly unsupported as a next hop type, so it cannot be chosen when creating a custom route. Question 31. A company enables a service endpoint for Azure storage. Afterward, administrators notice that VMs in the virtual network can reach the storage account privately, while access from a public VM is blocked. What explains this behavior? Select one answer. Option A. Service endpoints extend private address space to Azure resources. Option B. System routes automatically advertise public VM access. Option C. BGP routes override system routes when service endpoints are enabled. Option D. Virtual network gateways provide automatic access control. The correct answer is service endpoints extend private address space to Azure resources. Now that we've gone through the question and the correct answer, let's move into the explanation together. First, service endpoints work by extending the private IP space of your virtual network directly to supported Azure services, which means only traffic coming from inside the VNet can reach the storage account privately. This is why internal VMs succeed while public VMs fail. Additionally, system routes do not suddenly advertise public access, so that option wouldn't explain the behavior. Moreover, BGP routes do not interact with service endpoints, as BGP is used for hybrid routing scenarios rather than private access extension. Finally, virtual network gateways handle encryption and connectivity but do not enforce service endpoint restrictions, so they cannot be responsible for this outcome. Question 32. Which statement about user-defined routes is correct? Select one answer. Option A. You can configure multiple UDRs with the same address prefix. Option B, service tags can be used instead of explicit IP ranges. Option C, the next hop type virtual network service endpoint is supported. Option D, system routes can be deleted after UDRs are created. The correct answer is service tags can be used instead of explicit IP ranges. Now that we've reviewed the question and the correct answer, let's move into the explanation together. To begin with, service tags are designed to simplify route management by allowing administrators to reference Microsoft-managed groups of IP prefixes, rather than entering explicit addresses manually. As a result, routing configurations become far easier to maintain as cloud services evolve. Furthermore, multiple UDRs with the same prefix cannot be configured because Azure requires one unique route per prefix to avoid ambiguous routing decisions. Similarly, the virtual network service endpoint hop type is not supported in UDRs, since service endpoints operate differently, extending private IP access rather than defining routing paths. Lastly, system routes cannot be deleted because Azure relies on them as foundational routing behavior. UDRs can override them where allowed, but they are never removed. This structure ensures predictable routing while giving administrators flexibility through service tags. Question 33. Your company wants to host wideworldimports.com at the zone apex and route it to an Azure load balancer. The load balancer's public IP might change during its lifecycle. Which solution should you implement? Select one answer. Option A, create a CNAME record at the apex pointing to the load balancer. Option B, create an A record with the load balancer's current IP. Option C, create an alias record that points the apex to the load balancer resource. Option D, create an MX record that routes requests to the load balancer. The correct answer is, create an alias record that points the apex to the load balancer resource. Now that we have read the full question, all the options, and the correct answer, let us walk through the explanation together. First, the requirement is to host the domain at the zone apex, that is wideworldimports.com, without any subdomain, and still follow any future IP changes of the load balancer automatically. Alias records are designed exactly for this. They let the apex of the zone reference an Azure resource directly. So when the load balancer IP changes, DNS updates follow it without any manual work, which is why option C is correct. By contrast, a CNAME at the apex is not allowed in standard DNS, so option A cannot be used, even though CNAMEs can point to other names. Moreover, an A record with the current IP, option B, would work only until the load balancer IP is changed. At that point, users might see outages until you manually update the record, which breaks the goal of handling lifecycle changes smoothly. Finally, an MX record, option D, is only for directing email traffic, not web traffic to a load balancer. So it does not solve the problem at all in this scenario. Question 34. For each Azure Storage replication option, drag it to the appropriate boxes in the correct match column to match it against its defining behavior in the option column. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Replicates within a single data center. Lowest cost and lowest durability matches. Locally storage, LRS. Synchronously replicates across 3 availability zones in one region, matches zone redundant storage, ZRS, geo-replicates to a paired secondary region. The secondary is read only unless Microsoft fails over matches. Geo-redundant storage, GRS. Geo-replicates and also allows you to read from the secondary at any time. Matches read access geo-redundant storage, RAGRS. Combines zone replication in the primary region with geo-replication to a secondary matches geo-zone redundant storage, GZRS. Premium replication is not used for any of these behaviors. Now that we have matched every description with its correct replication option, let us walk through the explanation together. First, locally redundant storage keeps multiple copies in a single data center, so it is the cheapest choice but still vulnerable if that data center has a major outage. Additionally, zone redundant storage spreads data across 3 different availability zones in one region, which protects you from a single building or zone failure while keeping data close for low latency. Moreover, geo-redundant storage copies your data to a secondary region that stays read only until Microsoft performs a failover, giving regional disaster recovery without everyday reads there. Furthermore, read access geo-redundant storage builds on that model by letting your applications read from the secondary at any time, which is useful for reporting or global read scenarios. Finally, GeoZone redundant storage combines both ideas, using zones in the primary region and also replicating to a secondary region, giving the highest regional and zonal resilience for critical workloads that must stay available even during large-scale failures. Question 35. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. GRS and GZRS are both designed for at least 16 nines. Durability of objects over a year is true. Only RAGRS and RAGZRS provide read access to a secondary region during a region-wide outage is true. With LRS, a data center level disaster can render all replicas unrecoverable is true. ZRS replication is synchronous across 3 availability zones in one region is true. Now that we have reviewed every statement along with its correct true or false answer, let's move into the explanation together. To begin with, GRS and GZRS are engineered for extremely high durability, which is why Microsoft targets around 16 nines. This means your data is replicated in such a way that the chance of loss is extraordinarily low. Moreover, only the read access versions, RAGRS and RAGZRS, allow you to read from the secondary region. The standard GRS variants keep the secondary region read-only and inaccessible unless Microsoft initiates a failover. Additionally, LRS stores all copies within one data center, so if that data center suffers a catastrophic failure such as flooding or fire, all replicas could indeed be lost, which explains why durability is lower compared to other replication types. Finally, ZRS works by synchronously writing data across 3 independent availability zones within one region, providing strong protection against zone-level failures while keeping data instantly consistent across all zones. Question 36. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. A blob named myblob inside mycontainer in account mystorage account can be addressed at /mystorageaccount.blockcore.windows.net/mycontainer/myblob is true. In Azure Storage, the storage account name appears as the subdomain of the service endpoint is true. Custom domains for blob require creating a CNAME record from your subdomain to the blob endpoint is true. Custom domains for blob require creating a CNAME record from your subdomain to the blob endpoint. Direct mapping for custom domains is accomplished by creating an A record is false. Now that we have reviewed each statement and its correct true or false value, let's move into the explanation together. To begin with, Azure Blob URLs follow a consistent pattern, using the storage account name as the subdomain, which is why mystorageaccount.blobdoor.windows.net naturally resolves to the correct service endpoint. Additionally, since the storage account name always forms the subdomain, it becomes the primary identifier for accessing containers and blobs stored under that account. Furthermore, when you configure a custom domain for blob storage, Azure requires a CNAME record that points your chosen domain, such as files.contoso.com, to the storage endpoint. This ensures traffic flows correctly without exposing IP-based dependencies. Finally, Azure does not allow a record-based mapping for blob endpoints, meaning you cannot directly assign an IP to your custom domain for blob storage. The platform requires CNAME, so that endpoint changes are handled automatically by Azure's DNS layer. Question 37. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Soft delete is configured at the storage account level and can be applied to new and existing file shares. When enabled, deleted content enters a soft deleted state for a configurable retention period between 1 and 365 days, allowing recovery of files or entire shares. Now that we have reviewed the completed sentence with all correct selections, let's move into the explanation together. To begin with, Soft Delete is always configured at the storage account level because the feature applies across all file shares within that account rather than being set per individual share. Additionally, it supports both new and existing shares, meaning you can protect current workloads without recreating storage structures. Furthermore, once Soft Delete is enabled, any deleted item moves into a soft deleted state where it becomes recoverable instead of being permanently removed. Moreover, the retention period is fully configurable, giving administrators the flexibility to choose a data recovery window anywhere from 1 day up to 365 days, depending on governance or compliance needs. Finally, this retention window enables recovery, allowing you to restore lost files or entire file shares with just a few clicks, which is especially useful in accidental deletions or ransomware scenarios. Question 38. Arrange the following steps involved in accessing a tiered file via Windows Server in the correct order. A local placeholder exists as a reparse point for the tiered file. A user opens the tiered file from Windows Server. Azure File Sync recalls the file's data from Azure Files. The full file becomes available locally for the user's session. Now that we've gone through the steps in the correct sequence, let's move into the explanation together. To begin with, a tiered file starts as a lightweight placeholder represented by a reparse point, which allows Windows Server to know that the full content lives in Azure Files rather than on the local disk. As soon as the user tries to open that file, the system recognizes that the content is not available locally and triggers a recall operation. Consequently, Azure File Sync reaches out to Azure Files to pull down the actual data associated with that placeholder. Finally, once the download completes, the full file becomes available locally, allowing the user to work with it seamlessly as if it had always been stored on the server. Question 39. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. A container name must begin with a letter or number, can include only lowercase letters, numbers, and hyphens, and must be between 3 and 63 characters long. Now that we've reviewed the question and the correct answers, let's walk through the explanation together. To start, container names in Azure Storage follow strict DNS naming rules, which is why they must begin with a letter or number. This ensures compatibility across all storage endpoints and avoids issues with reserved symbols. Additionally, the allowed characters are intentionally limited to lowercase letters, numbers, and hyphens to maintain consistency and prevent conflicts with case sensitivity or special characters. Furthermore, the name length requirement of between 3 and 63 characters ensures that names are both descriptive enough and still functional for DNS-based addressing. Altogether, these rules help guarantee reliability, global accessibility, and predictable behavior when working with Azure Storage containers. Question 40. Which Azure Storage capability specifically targets reliable application communication by storing messages? A. The file system service providing fully managed file shares. B. The auto-scaling NoSQL table capability. C. The messaging store designed for reliable messaging. D. The fully managed relational database service. The correct answer is C. The messaging store designed for reliable messaging. Now that we've read the question and reviewed the correct answer, let's go ahead and walk through the explanation together. To begin, Azure's messaging store is built to reliably hold messages until the receiving service is ready to process them. This ensures messages aren't lost, even if the consumer is temporarily unavailable, which is essential in distributed applications. For example, imagine an order processing system where the web front end submits orders faster than the back end can process them. A messaging store such as Azure Queue Storage safely stores each order until the worker role picks it up. Meanwhile, the other options don't fit this requirement. The file system service deals with managed file shares, not queued communication. The auto-scaling NoSQL table capability focuses on structured data, not message delivery, and the fully managed relational database service is designed for relational workloads rather than messaging patterns. Question 41. A product team wants customers to upload images directly from their web browsers and then immediately view the images online without building custom file servers. Select one answer. A. Use Azure Files shares mounted to web servers for browser uploads. B. Use Azure Q Storage to hold the image binaries as messages. C. Use Azure Blob Storage to accept browser uploads and serve images directly to the browser. D. Use Azure Table Storage to store the images as key or attribute values. The correct answer is C. Use Azure Blob Storage to accept browser uploads and serve images directly to the browser. Now that we've gone through the question and the correct answer, let's move into the explanation together. To begin, Azure Blob Storage is purpose-built for scenarios where users upload and retrieve objects like images directly from the browser. It naturally supports HTTP and HTTPS access, making it ideal for serving images instantly without requiring a custom file server. For example, many modern web apps use blob storage for profile picture uploads because it easily supports large object handling and immediate public or authenticated access. Meanwhile, Azure Files is designed for SMB or NFS file shares rather than direct browser uploads. Azure Q Storage only holds text-based message payloads, not large binary image files. And Azure Table Storage is optimized for structured key-value data, not binary media. Question 42. Which targeting options can a lifecycle rule use to select blobs? Select three answers. A. Entire storage account. B. Specific containers. C. Subset via name prefixes. D. Subnet membership on a virtual network. The correct answers are A. Entire storage account. B. Specific containers. And C. Subset via name prefixes. Now that we've reviewed the question and the correct selections, let's smoothly transition into the explanation. First, lifecycle rules can target an entire storage account, meaning the rule applies across all containers and blobs without restriction. Next, you can narrow the scope by selecting specific containers, which is useful when only parts of your data require automated transitions or deletions. Additionally, name prefixes offer even more granular control. For instance, a company might prefix logs with app1-log/ and apply lifecycle rules only to that subset. However, subnet membership is unrelated because virtual network configuration has nothing to do with blob lifecycle targeting. Question 43. You need a container to store continuously growing application logs where writers append entries without modifying earlier data. Select one answer. A. Block blob. B. Append blob. C. Page blob. D. File share. The correct answer is B. Append blob. Now that we've gone through the question and the correct answer, let's move into the explanation. Append blobs are specifically designed for write-only, append-only scenarios, which makes them perfect for logging. Each new log entry is simply added to the end of the blob without touching any previous data, ensuring immutability of earlier entries. By contrast, block blobs are general purpose and not optimized for continuous appends, while page blobs target random read-write operations typically used for virtual machine disks. Likewise, a file share uses SMB semantics and isn't the right choice for this append-only logging pattern. Question 44. Identify the three statements that are accurate for authentication with Azure file shares. Select three answers. A. Identity-based authentication over SMB provides seamless SSO similar to on-premises file shares. B. Storage account access keys are static and grant full control. Sharing them bypasses access controls. C. A SAS token can directly authenticate SMB mounts for end users. D. Access keys provide granular, least privilege permissions scoped to a single directory. E. A SAS token for Azure Files is used only for REST API access from code. The correct answers are A. Identity-based authentication over SMB provides seamless SSO similar to on-premises file shares. B. Storage account access keys are static and grant full control. Sharing them bypasses access controls. E. ASAS token for Azure files is used only for REST API access from code. Now that we have read the question and the correct answers, let us move into the explanation together. First, answer A is correct because identity-based authentication over SMB lets users sign in to Azure file shares using their Azure AD or domain credentials, giving them the same seamless single sign-on experience they are used to in on-premises environments. Moreover, answer B is correct since storage account access keys operate like master passwords. They grant full control over the entire storage account, so sharing them bypasses all granular access controls you may have configured. Additionally, answer E is correct because SAS tokens for Azure files are designed specifically for REST-based access scenarios, providing temporary and scoped permissions without exposing sensitive account keys. On the other hand, answer C is not correct because SAS tokens cannot authenticate SMB mounts for end users. SMB requires identity-based authentication or the account key. Similarly, answer D is incorrect because access keys do not offer granular or least privilege permissions. They control the whole account rather than a single directory. Question 45. You're building an app on Azure that reads and writes blobs. Security mandates no embedded secrets in code or configurations, and operations want the simplest ongoing access management. What should you implement? Select one answer. A. Use shared key and store the account key in an app setting. B. Use Microsoft Entra ID with a managed identity and assign the appropriate RBAC role for blob data. C. Use a SAS generated from the account key and hardcode it in the app for a year. D. Enable anonymous access on the container so the app doesn't need credentials. The correct answer is B. Use Microsoft Entra ID with a managed identity and assign the appropriate RBAC role for blob data. Now let's move into the explanation. First, using Microsoft Entra ID with a managed identity is the best option because it removes the need to store secrets in code or configuration. Managed identities allow the application to authenticate securely without handling keys manually, and RBAC ensures fine-grained control over blob access. Meanwhile, using a shared key would expose a highly privileged secret, which violates the requirement of having no embedded secrets. Additionally, hardcoding a SAS token is insecure because SAS tokens can expire, must be rotated, and still embed sensitive information in the app. Finally, enabling anonymous access would completely bypass security and is not appropriate for reading and writing private data, especially in environments where confidentiality is required. So ultimately, the managed identity approach provides the simplest, most secure, and most maintainable solution for ongoing operations. Through this? Question 46. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. A. A VM requires supporting resources like disks, VNets, and IP addresses. True. B. Azure automatically names created resources using the VM name if you don't provide one. True. C. Network security groups incur additional charges in Azure. False. D. A resource group can contain multiple resources, but one resource can belong to more than one group. False. Now that we've gone through each statement and its correct true or false answer, let's move into the explanation. To begin, a virtual machine in Azure always needs supporting components such as storage disks, a virtual network, a NIC, and sometimes a public or private IP address. Without these, the VM cannot function, so the statement is indeed true. Next, Azure does help simplify provisioning. When you create a VM and don't specify names for certain dependent resources, Azure automatically generates them using the VM name as a prefix. This keeps deployments consistent and easy to identify. However, network security groups do not incur additional charges. Instead, they are included as part of the platform's networking features, so this statement is false. You only pay for resources like VMs, public IPs, or firewalls, not NSGs. And finally, a resource can only exist in exactly one resource group at a time. Even though a resource group can contain many resources, that relationship isn't many-to-many. It's always one resource in one group, which makes the last statement false. These principles together help ensure clean organization, predictable costs, and proper design across Azure deployments. Question 47. For each Azure Backup feature, drag it to the correct description. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. First, let's read all the items and their correct matches. Allocates and manages backup storage automatically. Automatic storage management. Replicates data to same region or distant secondary. Multiple storage options. Ensures secure transmission and storage. Data encryption. Includes all data required for full restoration. Application-consistent backups. No time limit for keeping backup data. Long-term retention. Now that we've gone through the questions and answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin with, automatic storage management is correct because Azure Backup automatically provisions and manages storage on a pay-as-you-use basis, eliminating the need for manual capacity planning. Moreover, multiple storage options fits replication because Azure Backup supports both locally redundant and geo-redundant storage, allowing data to stay within a region or replicate to a secondary region for higher durability. Additionally, data encryption is the right match for secure transmission and storage since Azure Backup encrypts data both in transit and at rest using strong encryption standards. Furthermore, application-consistent backups ensure that all data necessary for a full restoration is captured, preventing corruption and enabling clean recoveries for apps like SQL or IIS. Finally, long-term retention is correct because Azure Backup can keep recovery points indefinitely, which is essential for meeting compliance or archival requirements. And that completes the explanation for question 47. Question 48. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Let's begin by reading each statement along with its correct answer. Azure Backup charges for outbound data transfers. False. Azure Backup can scale without limits. True. Azure Backup integrates with Volume Shadow Copy Service for app-aware snapshots. True. Azure Backup limits how long backup data can be kept. False. Now that we've reviewed the questions and the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. First of all, outbound and inbound data transfers are free with Azure Backup, which is why the first statement is false. This makes Azure Backup more cost-effective compared to other storage or transfer mechanisms. Next, Azure Backup can scale without limits because it relies on Azure's underlying cloud scalability, meaning you never have to worry about running out of backup capacity as workloads grow. Furthermore, Azure Backup integrates with the Windows Volume Shadow Copy Service, enabling application-consistent snapshots. This ensures that services like SQL or Active Directory are backed up in a stable and recoverable state. Finally, the last statement is false because Azure Backup does not impose strict limits on how long data can be retained. In fact, retention can be configured for many years or even indefinitely to meet compliance or archival needs. And that wraps up the explanation for question 48. Question 49. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Let's read the completed statements with their correct answers. To protect on-premises files and folders, you can install the Azure Backup Agent. To back up Azure VMs, you use the Azure Backup VM extension. Now that we've gone through the answers, let's move into the explanation. First, the Azure Backup Agent is installed directly on on-premises servers or client machines. It enables file and folder-level backups, making it ideal for organizations that need granular protection for items stored locally. For example, a company running a local file server can use this agent to back up important shared documents to Azure with no additional infrastructure. Meanwhile, the Azure Backup VM extension handles backups for Azure virtual machines. It integrates natively with Azure's backup service, allowing full VM-level snapshots without requiring you to install anything inside the guest operating system. As a result, backups remain consistent, automated, and centrally managed. Altogether, both components work together to provide complete coverage across hybrid environments. Question 50. For each type of maintenance or downtime, drag it to the correct description. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Predictive failure handled with live migration. Unplanned hardware maintenance. Failure of network, disk, or rack causing downtime or reboot. Unexpected downtime. Microsoft host or hardware updates for reliability and security. Planned maintenance. Now that we've read all the items and their correct matches, let's move into the explanation. First, predictive failure handled with live migration maps to unplanned hardware maintenance. Because Azure detects potential hardware issues in advance and uses live migration to move the VM before actual failure occurs. This prevents major disruption, though the VM may briefly pause. Next, failure of network, disk, or rack causing downtime relates to unexpected downtime, since these events are unplanned, sudden, and often lead to VM reboots or temporary unavailability. For example, a sudden rack power failure would instantly trigger this type of downtime. Finally, Microsoft host and hardware updates for reliability and security correspond to planned maintenance, because these updates follow a scheduled process to patch and maintain the infrastructure. They typically do not update the guest OS, but they ensure the platform stays secure and optimized. And that completes the explanation for question 50. Question 51. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Azure Container Apps enables serverless microservices based on containers. Now that we've read the completed statement and the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin, Azure Container Apps is designed specifically for serverless microservices, meaning you can run distributed, event-driven applications without managing Kubernetes clusters or virtual machines. This allows developers to focus on code and scaling behavior rather than infrastructure. Furthermore, Azure Container Apps is built entirely around containers. Every workload runs inside a container image, regardless of the language or runtime. For example, you might deploy a lightweight API in a container that only spins up when triggered, aligning perfectly with serverless patterns. Additionally, although ACA is powered by Kubernetes under the hood, it abstracts away all cluster complexity, so users do not interact with nodes, pods, or cluster configurations. And finally, ACA is not intended for monolithic workloads. It thrives when applications are modular and composed of independent microservices. That completes the explanation for question 51. Question 52. Which two methods are specifically designed for developers to programmatically interact with Azure resources? Select two answers: A. Azure CLI, B. Azure PowerShell, C. Azure REST API, D. Azure Client SDK. The correct answers are C. Azure REST API, and D. Azure Client SDK. Now that we've gone through all the options and the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. To begin with, Azure REST API is intentionally designed for developers who need direct programmatic access to Azure. It exposes Azure resource operations as HTTP requests, allowing applications to create services, update configurations, or retrieve data without relying on command line tools. For example, a web app can call the REST API to automatically provision storage or scale resources. Additionally, the Azure Client SDK provides language-specific libraries like .NET, Python, JavaScript, and Java. These libraries wrap the REST API and make development smoother by handling authentication, request formatting, and responses. This lets developers focus on application logic rather than low-level API details. Meanwhile, Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI are primarily scripting and automation tools. They're excellent for administrators and DevOps workflows. However, they aren't designed to be embedded as programmatic APIs within applications. And that completes the explanation for question 52. Question 53. While practicing in the Microsoft Learn sandbox, you attempt to export a VM template from the portal, but the option is disabled. Why is this the case? Select one answer. A. The VM is not running. B. Sandbox policies restrict exporting templates. C. Export templates only work for Linux VMs. D. You must first enable auto shutdown. The correct answer is B. Sandbox policies restrict exporting templates. Now that we've reviewed every option and identified the correct one, let's walk through the explanation. To start with, the Microsoft Learn Sandbox applies strict limitations to prevent users from exporting or transferring resources outside the learning environment. Therefore, even though template exporting is fully available in normal Azure subscriptions, the Sandbox blocks this feature entirely for security and cost control reasons. Furthermore, the VM's running state has no impact on the export capability, so Option A doesn't explain why the export button is disabled. Likewise, export templates work for both Linux and Windows VMs, which eliminates Option C. And finally, auto shutdown is simply a cost-saving feature. It does not affect template export, making Option D incorrect as well. In summary, the Sandbox's built-in restrictions are the reason VM template export is not allowed. Question 54. Your company wants disaster recovery without maintaining a secondary data center? Which Azure feature best meets this need? Select one answer. A. Azure Load Balancer. B. Azure Site Recovery. C. Availability Zones. D. Azure Backup. The correct answer is B. Azure Site Recovery. Now that we've gone through all the options and identified the correct one, let me explain why this is the right choice. Azure Site Recovery is specifically designed for full workload replication and failover, meaning it allows your applications to continue running in Azure even if your primary data center goes completely offline. This eliminates the need to maintain a secondary physical facility, reducing both infrastructure and operational overhead. Meanwhile, Azure Load Balancer only distributes traffic across active instances and doesn't provide disaster recovery capabilities. Availability zones help protect against failures inside a single region, but they don't replace a secondary data center for cross-region resilience. And Azure Backup focuses on data protection rather than running workloads during an outage, so it doesn't address full application failover. So, Azure Site Recovery is the only option that fulfills the requirement of disaster recovery without needing a secondary data center. Question 55. What is the maximum number of VM instances supported in a scale set when using custom VM images? Select one answer. A, 1000, B, 800, C, 600, D, 500. The correct answer is C, 600. Now that we've reviewed all the choices, let's walk through the explanation. When you use custom VM images in a scale set, Azure limits the number of instances to 600 because the platform must distribute and maintain those custom images across the underlying infrastructure. This adds overhead compared to using platform-provided images, which is why the limit for those can go up to 1,000 instances instead. In contrast, options 800 and 500 don't match any valid scale set instance limits, so they aren't applicable here. Therefore, the maximum supported instance count for scale sets using custom images is 600. Question 56. A developer deploys a new app on Azure App Service. The app requires continuous background web jobs that run on a cron schedule. Which configuration should be enabled to meet this requirement? Select one answer. A. Session affinity. B. Always on. C. Publish as Docker container. D. HTTPS only. The correct answer is B. Always on. Now that we've gone through the options, let's move into the explanation. To keep background web jobs running continuously, especially those triggered by cron schedules, the app must remain active even when it's idle. That's exactly what Always On provides. It prevents the app service from unloading your app due to inactivity, ensuring those web jobs keep firing as expected. Meanwhile, Session Affinity only helps direct users to the same instance and has nothing to do with web job execution. Publishing as a Docker container is just a deployment method and doesn't keep jobs alive. And HTTPS only simply enforces secure connections without affecting background processing. So, enabling Always On is the key setting that ensures continuous, reliable web job activity. Question 57. Which statement about Azure Container Services is correct? Select one answer. A. Azure only supports Azure container instances for running containers. B. Azure provides multiple options for running cloud-native and containerized applications. C. Azure requires Kubernetes as the only way to run containers. D. Azure supports containers only inside virtual machines. The correct answer is B. Azure provides multiple options for running cloud-native and containerized applications. Now that we've reviewed all 4 options, let's move into the explanation. Azure offers a wide ecosystem for containerized workloads, and that's why option B is correct. You can run containers using Azure Container Instances, Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure App Service with container support, Azure Container Apps, and even functions with containerized deployments. This flexibility gives developers multiple ways to choose the best fit platform for their architecture. On the other hand, option A is incorrect because ACI is just one of many services. Option C is also incorrect since Azure doesn't require Kubernetes. In fact, ACI allows containers to run without any orchestrator at all. And option D is inaccurate because containers don't require virtual machines. They can run serverlessly on services like ACI. So, the correct understanding is that Azure provides a broad set of container-focused services, enabling cloud-native development with plenty of choice and flexibility. Question 58. You're deploying a VM that requires multiple network interfaces. During configuration, Azure prevents you from adding more NICs. What is the most likely reason? Select one answer. A. NICs require reserved IP addresses that are exhausted. B. You haven't deployed the VM in a paired region. C. NICs are billed separately and the subscription lacks credit. D. The VM size selected doesn't support additional NICs. The correct answer is D. The VM size selected doesn't support additional NICs. Question 59. For each statement below, indicate whether it is true or false. An action group can send both emails and voice calls when triggered. True. Action groups can be reused across multiple alert rules. True. Alert processing rules can only apply to a single resource, not to an entire subscription. False. By default, an alert processing rule is always active unless a schedule is specified. True. Now that we've gone through the statements and identified the correct answers, let's move into the explanation. First, an action group really can deliver notifications through multiple channels at once, including email, SMS, push notifications, and even voice calls. So it's absolutely true that both email and voice calls can be triggered together. Next, action groups are designed to be reusable, meaning once you configure one, you can link it to many different alert rules across your environment. This makes them efficient and consistent for operational alerting. However, the idea that an alert processing rule only applies to a single resource is incorrect. Because processing rules can be scoped broadly from a specific resource to a resource group, or even the entire subscription, offering flexibility depending on the operational need. Finally, alert processing rules are active by default. They only pause or change behavior when you configure a schedule, such as business hours or maintenance windows. This ensures alerts follow normal behavior unless you explicitly modify the timeline. So, those are the correct evaluations, and why each one makes sense in real-world Azure alerting scenarios. Question 60. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. An action group is a collection of notification preferences and actions, while an alert processing rule is used to add or suppress an action group after an alert has fired. Now that we've gone through the completed statements, let's walk through the explanation together. To begin, an action group serves as the bundle of everything that happens when an alert triggers. This includes who gets notified, through which channels, and what automated actions may run. It's basically the response plan tied to an alert. Meanwhile, an alert processing rule steps in after an alert fires and changes how that alert behaves. It can add an action group, suppress notifications, or modify response behavior based on time windows or conditions. For example, during maintenance hours, a processing rule might suppress alert noise, or outside business hours, it might add escalation contacts. So, the correct combination fits naturally. Action groups define the notifications and actions, and processing rules modify those behaviors dynamically once alerts have triggered.